What's up, my dudes? So, contrary to popular belief, you actually don't want it tight on MX Simulator. The tighter than foot knocks, coming with the toe styles, you know what I'm saying? You don't want that shit. You gotta have a certain amount of looseness to your setup in this game, and I wanted to go in here and explain the differences between, when they say like a loose or a tight setup on MX Simulator. So that's really what this video is all about. Just kind of going in here and explaining it to you, explaining the differences, the positives and the negatives to both of them. I think there are obviously positives and negatives to everything, but and this as well. But I think the positives with the more loose setup outweigh the negatives more so than the tighter style setup. But it's all a personal preference, and it's all your skill level makes a big difference. The more skill you put in, the more skill you have, the more time you put in, basically the looser you're going to get a setup. But there's certain people that just simply don't like a super loose setup, even when they are really good at the game. So this right here, I've got it set up basically just about as loose as you can make the bike in MX Simulator. So you can see there's a lot of forward, backwards leaning, a lot of, vertical actual movement going on with the bike here. I'm able to really huck the bike up, jump stuff. Basically, it's having a super high rider mass distribution, and a lot of the vertical, horizontal spring stuff's been adjusted pretty hardcore. Also with the, obviously, stability adjusted super hardcore. So that's what they mean when they say loose, is it's like how much movement you have on the bike, how loose it is. But when they say stiff, it's more like it's more handicapped in a sense to where you don't have as much movement forward and backwards. You don't have as much leaning. You don't have as much potential to huck jumps and all that kind of stuff, which it's one of those things where it's like, with more power comes more responsibility, so with more movement comes more responsibility. So if you're able to move that thing more, there's way more of a chance of it flipping over too far or turning too sharp or whatever the case may be. So that's kind of the whole nature of it is, yeah, you can have a super loose setup and it's probably going to make certain jumps easier and certain things easier, like going through whoops and all that kind of stuff, but also it's way harder to control the bike, basically. So, by the way, do any of you guys remember this track? What's up, dog? Can never forget. Hashtag never forget. Yeah, either way, man, I always have a good time coming back to this track right here. Fond memories, let's just say. Okay, so I'm going to get this on, that was like the super loose, right? If you can kind of remember what that looked like. Now, this is like what you call more on the stiff side of a setup. For a pro, this is not like beginner stiff, but it's like what you call a stiff pro setup, in my mind anyway. So, basically, even though with a loose setup, it might feel like and visually look like you're able to huck stuff bigger and go through the whoops faster, I will say that sometimes when you make your setup too loose, it can feel like it plays mind tricks on you, where it seems like you're going faster, seems like you're jumping stuff bigger, but you're actually not. So that's one thing I've noticed, whereas the more stiffer you make it, the more direct it's actually doing. Like, for instance, let's just say you have a super stiff setup like this right here, and you feel like you're going really fast in your head, and you feel like you're going to get a really fast lap time. Well, odds are you probably will when you come around to it, if it feels like it. But if you have a super loose setup, it can feel like you're going really fast, but you come around to see what kind of lap time you got, and you're like, what the hell? That's not nowhere near as fast as I thought it was. Because when it's really loose like that, it can play tricks on you and make you feel like you're going faster than you actually are. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind there, and just remember about it. It definitely will do that to you in certain aspects of cornering and ruts. If you have it too loose, it can make that feel weird. So it's all just kind of, for me personally, I try to find a nice little balance between it all. I've tried just about everything, as far as like super loose, super stiff, all that. But you can see with this stiffer setup right here, nowhere near the amount of vertical movement going on. And on some of that really loose gameplay with that other bike I had there, I had some crazy saves in the whoops. You're able to save it a lot better because you got more movement. But with the stiffer setup, you can't. It's a lot harder to hit that big quad over there on this track, and it's a lot harder to save it once it starts swapping in the whoops. But I'm just wanting you guys to be aware, like if you go in there and try a really loose setup, it's gonna feel great. It's gonna feel like, oh God, I finally figured out the whole trick to the game. But you got to understand that it's not all roses at the end of the day with a super loose setup. Like, there's aspects of it that make it worse. There are negatives where you'll actually be losing time if you have too loose of a setup. And so that's just something to remember. That's a little bit more of an advanced sort of guide or tip there to try to explain to you, but you almost have to be at like a pro level to even really understand what I'm saying, because as a beginner, you've got it pretty stiff just to be able to control it anyways. So you can see right there, pretty much impossible to bring that back around with it that stiff. But yeah, I mean, everybody's different. Like I said, everybody's got their own kind of way of doing it there. But for me personally, basically, by the way, I'm back to the loose setup here in some third person. Like, I pretty much just made it to where the Monster Energy graphics on this Kawasaki is the super loose setup, and then the stock Kawasaki look is the stiff setup. So, yeah, it's one of those things. Everybody does it different. There's some really, really fast people that have a super loose-looking setup, and there's some really, really fast people that have a super stiff setup. And you could even go as far as to say your gearing plays a little bit of a part in it, because if you have a super mellowed-out gearing, then it makes it a bit more of a stiff setup, whereas if you have more of a quick acceleration slide out of the corner, that's more of a loose setup because you're sliding the bike around in every corner. So it's all aspects of the bike that come together to make it either loose or stiff. And just because I'm saying you can either have a loose or stiff setup, you can have all the world of in the middle. You know what I'm saying? It's a full spectrum. Like, you can have a setup that's a little bit closer to the stiff but not fully stiff, or you can have one that's a little bit closer to the loose but not fully loose. You can have it right down the middle, or you can have it all the way loose, you can have it all the way stiff. Like, there's a ton of combinations here. So just because I say loose versus stiff, don't get confused in thinking I'm saying you can only either have it loose or stiff, and some people's loose is not the same as other people's loose. Wow, gotta be careful talking about that. Let's just not even get into that, okay? But, you'd think in general you want it tight. I mean, we'd all just think you want it tight. That's common sense. You want it tight, but you can have it too tight in MX Simulator, you know what I'm saying? You can have it to the point where it's like so tight that you just don't have the movement necessary to fully function on the bike. You don't have the movement necessary to maneuver that puppy, and then you start running into issues, and then, it's like that. But you can go too far, too wild on the looseness of it, and then you can't even get your bases on the track. So for me personally, I've just basically found one way, there were some Supercross seasons I would try it super loose. Some seasons I would try it a little more stiff and go on and off in between it, here and there and everywhere. But it seems like once I found that certain sort of area where I liked it and then did really, really well, like my first top 5 in a Supercross race, I think that was in like 16 or something like that. You guys know I was like jumping over Hunter Root on that old Suzuki model, and I think that was actually back when it was a Suzuki Dyno as well. Was that in 16 or was that in 15? I can't remember exactly, but I just remember like I was literally jumping lines where I was like jumping over Root. I mean, I was on it, dude, back then. And like in the 250 class, I was leading the main events, doing really, really well. So I'm trying to get my whole entire bike setup and gearing and everything honed back into the way I had it then, because that's obviously I was way faster and more comfortable with it back then. Whereas I got too into that trying to fix something that wasn't broken. I was trying to make myself even faster when I should have just been trying to continue to get better with that current setup that I had. I was trying to make it even more loose, and then it got too loose, and then I wasn't going very fast and falling in every corner. And then I was like getting caught up in thinking the looser I have it, it's going to make it way easier to hit these bigger quad lines, which is not always necessarily the case. And sometimes it just looks like it. You're not actually doing it. It's this weird thing where it can feel like you're going faster, but you're not when it's super loose. So to me, it was just about finding that balance and trying to kind of this next Supercross season and motocross season, this will be the first real season that I have like my old school setup for the entire season. Like whenever I was doing really well back in 16, I've got everything right back to where it was, and I'm noticing it with my lap times on certain Supercross tracks. Like, it's crazy how Supercross, it's all about the hundredths and the tenths and the everything about it. So if you're just off one tick, then you're like not going to win, basically. You got to be on point everywhere. So I was noticing that on some of those Supercross tracks, though, with this current setup that I have, even though it's slides you out in the corners a little more, and not the one that you're seeing right here. This is the, like, what I would call super, super, super loose. Basically, like, I was noticing how much better of lap times I was getting. Like, I was able to run some of the fastest Supercross lap times I've ever seen on certain tracks. I was able to do it, whereas some of those other setups, it just felt like it wasn't even possible no matter how good I rode on the track. But now, with that setup, it's just like, it just fits me well, and that's all there really is to say to it. It just fits my riding style. So, yeah. But, I mean, but there's times where I'll hop on there with that super loose setup, and I'm like, oh, my God. I'm, like, flying through the whoops, 8th gear tapped out, and these whoops ain't even difficult, right, when I make it super loose. And it's like, that's what made me start trying to make my setup looser, because of just how good it feels when you make it loose. It just feels like you can do anything on the bike. But you always have to remember is, if you can do anything on it, then there's a certain point. I guess there's just a certain point there, like, don't get caught up in trying to make it looser, because you will lose your agileness, your sharpness, your skill, how fast of a lap time you're actually getting. You'll lose it in the fray if you, try too hard to keep on changing your setup and keep changing it. You got to get to a certain point where you're just, not that you got to be totally just like, okay, I'm running this setup forever, but just like, you got to get a little bit more, like, try to get used to something. If you're changing it all the time, you can't get used to anything. So, and that's what's more important than anything, is more important than the actual setup itself, is how used to it are you. And I've been saying that since day one, but that's the honest to goodness truth. And there's times where I'll go in there and have like a super stiff setup. I think that was like in 17, and I was freaking leading one of the 450 main events with a super stiff setup for like 4 or 5 laps, and I think I crashed on the whoops or something. Had a weird little kick on it, but like, I've done well with all of it, but I just think there's certain ones that fit me better, more consistent over a long, like, full season type of vibe. So that's basically what it comes down to. But either way, hope I tried to explain the loose, stiff setup thing good enough to you. It's kind of a confusing thing if you're not really deep into the game, but yeah, it's just something you got to learn and figure out for yourself, man. Got to go in there and test it out, figure out where your riding style matches up with however loose or stiff you make your setup, and trying to intertwine that perfectly to where the bike fits your ride style, so then it feels like you're one with the bike. That's kind of the whole goal there. You're trying to get it where it fits your riding style perfectly. So either way, appreciate you guys watching all the videos. Later, my dudes.